could we not explain consciousness, morality? I think that we can eventually explain those things through rigorous science. At the age of 5, I decided that I should be vegetarian because I thought it was mean to kill animals. Jainism has this very strict set of eating. You can't even pour hot water down the drain at risk of killing microorganisms. Maybe they could accuse vegans of being inconsistent. My better future probably starts with myself. I endeavor to be consistent, to examine my own actions, to do more good, how to understand the difference between right and wrong, real and illusory. What is the right thing to do?
Good morning, Jared. How are you?
Hey, Jamie. I'm well. Thanks for having me on today.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure. Thanks for making the time. We're from the somewhat sunny Seattle morning before the heat kicks into a slightly drab London afternoon. So it's great to span the globe. And thanks for making the time.
I would take a London afternoon right now.
Yeah. Yes, it's like it's pretty brutal there at the moment. Well, it's brilliant to get the chance to talk to you. It's a series, I guess, of conversations about what I think of as the two deepest philosophical questions, the questions of epistemology, what's real and how should we go about believing things about reality, and equally as important, the question of what matters and who matters, the questions of ethics. And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to popularize and develop this really simple pluralistic worldview I'm calling sentientism, which in a sentence is evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. So it suggests that when we're thinking about how to believe, we should use evidence and reason in a sort of humble naturalistic approach. And when we're thinking about our ethical scope, the clue is in the name, that at least every sentient being, any being that has the capacity to have experiences, to suffer, to flourish, should matter in our ethical considerations. But I have the pleasure of talking in these conversations to a wide variety of people, whether they agree with that worldview or not. So it'll be interesting to understand your own journey and your story and your philosophical story as we go through that. But before we get on to those big questions, how would you best introduce yourself and your work?
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited for the conversation as well. Right now, I'm working at the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence here in Seattle as a researcher. I just finished being a lecturer at the University of Washington, where I've taught classes on artificial intelligence, like the math of it. I taught a class on the philosophy of AI, which is a lot of fun, a class that I made. And I've taught for a number of years classes on computer ethics or AI ethics, depending, trying to think about. My initial motivation when I was going to school, I was trained as a computer scientist, was to think about the implications of the tools software engineers make. But much more broadly, I have been interested in thinking about, similar to you, like what are the right things to do and how do we bring those sorts of things about? What's interesting to me about artificial intelligence is that it's a sandbox in a way to test out a lot of these ideas, to formalize them mathematically oftentimes. And so that's a lot of what my main work is. But I also have a book coming out in 2 weeks from the time that we're talking about this conversation, the 1st of September, called The Strength of the Illusion, it's a novel, actually, a philosophical novel that explores a lot of these kinds of ideas that I just described. I'm supposed to describe it as a timely meditation on what happens when artificial intelligence clashes with human stupidity.
Yeah, that's what the publishers have told you to say. But...
Yeah, exactly. I'm not as good with taglines.
Yeah. Oh, no, that sounds fascinating. Thank you. And I agree as well. I think many of the people I sort of talk to and work with in some of the fields of activism find the artificial intelligence space, maybe a bit of an intellectual or a philosophical distraction. But I think it's fascinating, both in its own right as a field, but also because, as you said, it can be a real sort of creative sandbox, a place to explore some of these sort of deep assumptions and concepts that we might use even in everyday life and in, intrahuman and inter-sentient ethics too. Yeah. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, there are all of the issues that then arise with artificial intelligence as it's practiced, is that the discipline, the people, the AI companies, etc. But I guess I was speaking more about the academic parts there. And then, of course, as to your questions about sentientism, it raises a lot of interesting concerns in cognitive science and philosophy of mind about what does it mean to think, to learn, etc., which I'm sure we'll get into.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you. Well, let's start with the first of those crazily broad philosophical questions, that sort of what's real question. And for many of my guests, that starts out as a conversation about whether they grew up originally in quite maybe a scientific and naturalistically minded household and society, or one that was maybe a bit more supernatural or religious or spiritual in some sense, and how that side of their thinking has changed over time about, either a supernatural view of the world, a naturalistic view of the world, or something else. And that question of, religious, not religious, is only one of many topics where we could choose to apply epistemology, but that's often where people start. But feel free to answer that question however you like.
I appreciate it. I think it makes sense to understand where people are coming from. I grew up with a father who derided religion, so it was very much a very atheistic upbringing, which in some parts I regret as an adult. For I have many people who grew up in more religious, community-centered kind of upbringings, and while I still agree with the epistemological tenets of atheism, I am less the kind of cultural or experiential parts, less so. So in terms of thinking about what's real, I have little reason to. I'm not convinced about the kind of existence of God or something like that, nor really with spirituality. But that's not to say that I want to discount the feelings of religious experience or spirituality. We can go back and read William James and on the varieties of religious experience to think about how fascinating the phenomenon of these experiences are. So I would say that's a bit of a beginning, but I'm happy to dive into more details.
Yeah, thank you. And your father's sort of derision, where did that come from? Was that a reaction against his own upbringing, or so what was he pushing against? Because that's quite a classic starter tag, and I probably went through that phase myself as a sort of slightly angry, rebellious teenager. But what do you think was driving his, or maybe he still does drive his?
It's a really good point. His parents weren't religious, so it's hard for me to think that it was a reaction against that. But I think that they had, my grandmother is Irish, and she hates the Catholic Church with a passion. And so he probably carried over a little bit of that. And I think he's a medical doctor as well. And so I think in working as a primary care and family medicine doctor, there was a lot of anti-science feelings popularly. So I would imagine that this caused a bit of, developing a thick skin or a kind of hardening to some of those topics, which, because I haven't had those experiences, I can be much more loose about them. And in university, I joined a gospel choir, which is, I'm not religious, but it's a really fun and enlivening way to approach life.
Yeah, thank you. And it was interesting you mentioned that. I think you'd hinted at a couple of aspects there about the meaningfulness of a religious experience, whatever that might be, but also the sense that maybe you missed out a little bit on the community aspect of it. That can be like a rich part of a religious community upbringing as well. But it is a difficult dynamic, because some of the challenges of a religious or a supernaturalistic worldview, I think, can be deeply brutal and deserve to be challenged and attacked and resisted. And that might be driving some form of exclusionary ethics. We look most commonly at things like homophobia and sexism and out-group bigotry that can come from a religious worldview, or even some of the things that are built into it. I would argue that telling young children they're going to burn in hell for eternity if they don't follow the rules is somewhat unethical, right? So there are some things where, I think there should be a robust and strong pushback, and maybe some of the stuff your dad might have experienced in the medical world, right? If there are people refusing valid medical treatments for supernatural reasons, or turning to supernatural solutions when they really need actual medicine, or alternative medicines when they really need actual medicine. So I can understand those challenges, but it is difficult because that can lead to a sort of angry atheist sort of rejection of the entire enterprise. But there are still things of value in those fields that.
Yeah, it's not been my life to combat religion as I would see the Four Horsemen, Dan Dennett, Sam Harris, and folks as doing. In my personal experience, I think there's just value in being kind to each other. When you talk about this, it's not always the time to get all embattled about our positions and go off on a screed about how something is wrong. And few people are willing to actually debate the tenets of their beliefs. I think this is probably why you have the intro you do to scientism about it being, founded in reason or something along these lines, open to critique, scientific in a sense. And that's, of course, the tension between science and religion, and that kind of unwillingness by design to accept alternative hypotheses and test their views is what perpetuates religion. And that's also why there's such a clash.
And I think that's the core of it to me. It's that having enough doubt and humility to be ready to change your mind, having enough doubt and humility to be willing to test your own beliefs and credences against reality to see if they actually tie up, and having the bravery to change your mind if the evidence is different. I think that is the essence of it. And of course, there are many people with a naturalistic and a scientific worldview who fail by those standards too, right? Because, we
all fail by those standards.
Yeah, we all do. But I think the question is whether we in the institutions then recognize that failure and correct it, or whether you just sort of double down on the failure. But
yes, absolutely. Yeah, I do agree.
And so it sounds like you probably have that broadly naturalistic stance. You remain atheistic with an appreciation for some of the value that can play through a religious context. But you mentioned you weren't drawn to sort of spirituality or other aspects of the sort of supernatural or transcendent either. And that's quite an interesting dynamic, because some of my guests have moved away from a formal institutionalized religion because of ethical issues or because of dogmatic issues, but they've still wanted to retain some sense of the transcendent or the beyond or the supernatural. So they end up almost in a sort of spiritual but not religious sense. But it sounds like you've not been drawn to those things either.
I haven't been drawn to them. I guess part of it, to me, seems, I don't want to step on anyone's toes here, but it seems a bit like Mysterianism, which is sometimes a term used in philosophy to describe an appeal to mystery before the facts are out, more or less. Why assume that something is your explanation indeed the most parsimonious or kind of likely one? Could we not explain consciousness, morality, name whatever other held close to chest abstraction that people like and appeal to spirituality, etc., to justify? I think that we can eventually explain those things through rigorous science. And that leads some to reject the claims. You can't explain what it is like to be me. You can look at the history of debates about consciousness, Searle's Chinese Room, Thomas Nagel's What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And these appeals are in a sense spiritual. They're appealing to some kind of mystery that allows for the way that people are. And I just think that it's the world evolves, and there was selection processes in a variety of senses. We can come to an explanation, but that explanation doesn't need to be, how shall I say, a letdown. Just because we explain the illusion does not mean that the illusion doesn't exist.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I think there's at least a couple of different responses to a mystery. One, which I like, is that's fascinating. Let's find out more and acknowledge we might not ever get the answer, but let's keep trying. And there's as much wonder and fascination in that process as there is in the answer. And the other approach is, when you experience something that is a mystery, is to accept the mystery as the answer and stop looking. And that, yes, I find deeply frustrating and irritating. I think sometimes people with a scientific worldview can be criticized for being sort of too cut and dried and almost denying the possibility of mystery or wonder. And I think that's a fair criticism, because even a lot of what science has found out so far is deeply weird, right? Deeply, deeply weird, right? So we should be open to weird ideas, but let's not posit an answer until we've actually got evidence to back it up, right? You can be open-minded about crazy stuff, but don't jump to a belief until there's something to back up the credences.
And I think there's a degree of bad blood, perhaps, where scientists will only admit the few things in the experimentally verified results that they have at the moment. And so you can think of the behaviorists in the mid 20th century holding things very tight to chest, not able to explain mental phenomena, and therefore saying that discussion of consciousness or other kinds of internal states, emotions, are not scientific or not worth talking about, simply because they just didn't have the adequate methods to study those things. And so there's this tension where scientists are imperfect and can be mean.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. This is a slightly weird tangent, but as we wrap up this sort of question about what's real in epistemology, and in nearly every one of my conversations, we're talking about humans, right? And how humans come to believe things and on what basis. From your academic work, but also from your fiction writing with a new book, how have you come to think about whether artificial intelligences, do they have epistemology? In what sense are they learning? Can they know things?
It's a really good question. There's the way that has been put recently in a subfield of AI is about understanding in particular. So there are large language models like ChatGPT understand language. This is epistemological in nature. Do they understand? Do they know language? That's one thing. And then another could be, do they actually understand the reference implied, the things that our words refer to? Can they truly understand shape and color and all of these things that seem to be beyond language itself? This has been a big debate in AI the past couple of years that I imagine you and many of your listeners have at least heard about, because these tools are so popular. The intuitive response is, well, when using these tools, GPT-4, OpenAI's most recent large model, or Claude, Anthropic's, or a variety of others, seem to be able to use language okay. You probably have played around these tools. Some of your listeners might have. They make errors, but humans make errors too.
Oh yeah.
And so it's hard to say. I mean, it seems like they know some things. It might be that they have a different set of things that they know than what humans know. And so you would say that there's not a kind of parallelism with the ontology. Perhaps they only know a kind of word-like things, these models, as opposed to something more robust as human organisms experience. But I find it hard to truly say that they don't understand when they can use language in with such apparent ease. There are a lot more particularities in terms of what we mean by these things. And I don't need to go down that academic rabbit hole. But yeah, I think that there's obviously something there. And exactly what is still being debated.
And I think it's one of those interesting areas where digging into that can help us understand and elucidate what we mean by these concepts in the first place. Because I think quite often there is this default stance that, understanding is something that humans do and only humans do, and we don't need to interrogate it beyond that. So as soon as you start to say, well, could an artificial intelligence or even could a non-human animal know something, there's an instinctive response which is, no, they couldn't because they're not human. And that's not a particularly deep way of thinking about what knowledge means. And I think partly, again, in a naturalistic context, when I come back to my thinking about how we as humans as human animals evolved over time. And my view is that, basically I'm a sort of physical evolved being, right? That can give me some sort of parallel into thinking about, there isn't some mystical sense in which humans know and understand. Ultimately, I think it's patterns of information processing in some god awful, messy, wet sense in my head, right? But yeah, that's one of those areas where I think thinking open-mindedly about these concepts in an artificial intelligence context can help us re-examine what it might really mean for us. But
absolutely, and I think that that's a lot of the value in, as I said previously, thinking about AI as a sandbox. In a way, you can control all of the parameters, you can twiddle the knobs more or less, and then see what improves performance on some tasks and what doesn't, in a way that we can't with organisms. And so that's quite fascinating. Now, of course, I think that some more boosters of AI get into trouble by over-endorsing the kind of knowledge in systems, or imagining that it will be better than it is in an unrealistic time frame. Of course, we run into that as well. But yeah, somewhere in the middle, I think, is quite appropriate.
Yeah, thank you. So let's move on to the second of these big questions, this question of what matters and, I guess, ethics, but also as part of that, who matters and who should we care about, who should get compassion, who should get moral consideration in our ethical systems. And for people like you and me with a broadly naturalistic way of thinking, it's quite an interesting question to address, because we're not given a package of religious worldviews with rules and guidance and a God to obey, right? We have to find some other basis for our ethics. So again, I'm interested in, even from your earliest days of when you first started to think about good and bad and right and wrong, how did those things come into view for you, and how have you come to think about them now? What do they even mean?
As a child, you mean, or
yeah. Again, I guess in the context of growing up with a non-religious family, right? There were messages there, no doubt, about good and bad and right and wrong, and on what basis were those put forward to you, or did they just absorb?
Interesting. Unfortunately, I think more easily of examples where I believed to have figured out what was right and wrong, independent necessarily of what I was told.
Oh yeah,
It was a bit iconoclastic or difficult, in other words. So, for instance, at the age of 5, I decided that I should be vegetarian because I thought it was mean to kill animals.
At 5, yeah.
Yeah, 5, quite a precocious age.
And that was because it was mean to kill animals.
Yes,
Is it that simple?
I use that language because that's what I would have thought when I was 5. But
yeah.
Yes, I would have a different description now. That it's animals and other organisms are deserving of moral patience, of our moral attention. They have some weight. What exact weight is unclear.
It's a bit of a tangent, but I think your thinking as a 5-year-old was more advanced philosophically than the average adult human. So that's pretty impressive. But what reaction did you get from parents and those around you when you sort of made that declaration at 5?
It's hard to remember exactly the kind of reaction, but I stuck to my guns, and so I think they eventually let me do what I want. And I then convinced both of my siblings, actually, also to become vegetarian.
Oh, wow. And were they older or?
There was one older and one younger.
Yeah.
So I convinced. Then we were the majority at that point. And so they thought they had to make dinner for us.
That's pretty impressive. Pretty impressive. And how about when you were at school and sort of friends and wider society? Did that?
I revisited a lot of these discussions with myself and with others. I think that even growing up in a naturalistic kind of worldview, there are cultural senses of what is right and what is wrong. I grew up jaywalking, for example. But if I'd grown up in Germany, where my step-grandmother is from, I would have probably not grown up jaywalking, which is quite unacceptable to jaywalk. This is this doesn't seem like it carries the same kind of moral weight as animal welfare, perhaps, but it's an interesting exercise in thinking about how the culture you're in determines this sorts of landscape of what is right and wrong, which is vaguely how I think about ethics and how ethics emerges also over cultural evolutionary time. There's many. These discussions could get into become very political in nature. Who is deserving of attention as a person in that kind of democracy becomes a question of distribution and welfare and such, and then these lead into probably discussions that we don't want to be having right now. But those are, I was very occupied by a lot of those thoughts through my school days, being involved in debate and the groups that think about these kinds of things very often, thinking that I needed to, in some kind of sense, do the most good for other people. It's been in my university years that I have tried to really drill down and think what that means and why one way as opposed to another. Like what is the right objective more generally, and why do I think the things that I do are right or wrong? As you mentioned, I teach ethics classes, so I really have to be able to think about some of these things.
Yeah, and it sounds like you started off at 5 years old thinking about not being mean, if you like, and kindness, and sort of, without getting too formal about it, it's a sort of a virtue-based thing of just, how should I act in the world? It sounds like there's also an appreciation there for, cultural context and how that shapes things, which people can think of in a descriptive way. This is just the reality of how people's ethics get shaped. But other people can also take that in a more normative sense, where they start to say, well, maybe morality and ethics is more relativistic, and it's more something in the context of a group rather than something you can look at objectively. But you've also got this strong theme of actually taking that to a really strong stance of thinking about, trying to do the most good, and some ideas about sort of almost a maximizing ethos. So where do you get on? How would you summarize that stuff now? Do you have a sort of pluralistic view that uses bits of those? Are you more dedicated to a particular ethical sort of philosophy and school of thought? Or
I really appreciate this. You're more or less poking holes and naming different parts of my life as adhering to different branches of normative ethics, which I actually have a textbook of sitting on my desk at the moment. And I think that's quite right. It's the youth sample life's pleasures before they then, exploit and continue down a certain path. As it stands now, you're asking, are you a utilitarian? Are you a Kantian or something along those lines? Do you like following rules? Do you like multiplying and adding? I would say that I have kind of hesitations about all branches of normative ethics, but I would probably take a bit from each and a sort of pluralistic approach, as you said. Although if I really had to say, I would describe my position as being a naturalistic sort of ethics. I like Patricia Churchland's work. I don't actually agree with her positions necessarily, like the normative positions that she takes, but she attempts to ground out ethics and morality in evolution. She studies prairie voles and montane voles and looks at the degree of pair bonding as explained by the number of oxytocin receptors in the montane vole's brain and things like this. Very reductive. That makes most people quite unhappy about ethics. Ethical thinking emerged over human evolutionary time. Other species are not able to discuss the appropriate means of action, but we are. And what leads us, the question is, what leads us to do this in the evolutionary time scale? One argument goes that it is a way of, ethics emerges as a way of stabilizing social groups in a kind of tribal society. Doing the right thing might be like the jaywalking example earlier, the kind of dress that you do, how you kill and prepare a sort of animal. It might seem ritualistic, but those rituals might be approximating a degree of cleaning, for example, and therefore be adaptive and continue to spread. These are cultural adaptations, kind of cultural adaptations that lead to the emergence of language itself. So I see no firm boundary between the things that, not killing and such, what seem like very clear moral cases, and jaywalking, which seem more like inconsequential kinds of cases. Of course, this makes it difficult to say. You then would accuse me of relativism, of saying that, oh, it doesn't really matter one way or another. That's what people often take relativism to mean. But I don't think that's the case necessarily. It's as if we are navigating a kind of landscape. It's a very messy landscape. But just as the wings are an efficient means of navigating the air and have been found by evolution in bats and birds by different kinds of routes, you could imagine the landscape, the fitness landscape of social relations and ethics as having fixed points or obvious solutions, like wings in the case of birds and bats. And maybe those obvious solutions are things like fairness and equality and different kinds of abstractions as we think about them amongst people. So that's very vaguely how I think about it.
Interesting, thank you. And it's, I guess that idea of there being a sort of messy landscape that different ethical systems are trying to navigate makes sense to me, again, at least descriptively. But there's one sense in which that landscape is determined by a sort of classic evolutionary fitness landscape, where the fitness is not about being morally good. The fitness is about the ability for the individual or maybe even the group to stay alive and replicate, right? Which could actually involve some really nasty ethics. So there's one sense in which that landscape is somewhat amoral, right? Because it's just about us continuing to exist as patterns. And that, I think, would lead you to a more relativistic stance where you say, well, there's no objective morality at all. It's just what helps us continue to survive, even if that's brutally awful to some other groups. But there's a different perspective, which I'm not sure which you were laying out, which I quite like, which is to say, look, yeah, there's a messy landscape. There's lots of unknowns. Different ethical systems are approaching this in different ways. But as you said, there are some fixed elements to any of our morality, or there should be in my mind. And to my mind, that fixed element is the perspective of others and valuing the perspective of others. And obviously, in my context, I'm thinking all sentient beings are an other, because by definition, they can value their own existence and their own experiences. And so to my mind, the fixed thing about this landscape of working out morality, in some sense, has to value others in some way, shape, or form. And that might lead you to saying, well, intrinsically, therefore, suffering is bad. Intrinsically, therefore, being killed when you don't want to die is a bad thing. These sort of, are there some things we can appeal to almost regardless of the ethical system, such that we could find an ethical system that seems to have reached some sort of fitness peak on the landscape because that group is very successful. But we can say, you're causing egregious, brutal suffering. Therefore, you might have a successful moral system, but it is actually immoral or amoral.
I hear this. It's difficult for me because, to me, coming up with all of the right things to do, more or less, the fixed solutions or the fixed points, seems to me like a rule-based ethics, which in the jargon is deontology. It's so unlikely for there to be one set of rules just on the probability of it, and all of you can read normative philosophy and all of, is it this rule or is it this rule? And well, you could interpret this rule slightly differently. And there's all this messiness when we have to actually come and ground out those theories. So I'm quite hesitant about deontological ethics for this reason.
And to be clear, I would agree that I think the idea that those rules or those solutions might be fixed good luck with that, right? I think what's fixed is just the frame of reference for how we assess good and bad. And in that sense, personally, I'm quite comfortable linking the good and bad of experience to the good and the bad of ethics.
I think that's fair.
But that could still leave you in a position where you've got really no idea, exactly what the solutions are or what the rules are or the best approach, or whether you should take a care ethic or a different approach. You could still be just as confused, but at least you do have that frame of reference that would, for example, say, intrinsically suffering is a negative thing almost by definition. So could we agree with that at least?
I would like to say so. My intuition is yes, basically. But I think that I would probably argue for it on the grounds of consistency, rather than on the grounds of it being necessarily right. To me, in a sense, I'm arguing for a relativistic position, but now that the position is relative to is the evolutionary history of humans, which on the grand universal scheme of things is changing. It could have been different, but for us, it is how it is, and it will not change. Now, the question that you raised is, could there be an adaptive, fitness maximizing, ethical policy which is nonetheless bad, basically, where we seem to be doing things and then it's not what we later realize is correct. And I think that's obviously the case. We can look at human history, think about slavery, think about women's rights, a variety of things. Today, think about animal rights, and find these kinds of things. But I would say that this is, to me, what makes them apparent is the appeal to consistency, because we recognize that, we treat each other as deserving of moral attention. I treat your neighbor like you would yourself, or a family member. Now, well, why not somebody else? Why not somebody on the other side of the world, for example? Why not? Why do you treat your dog differently than you do the factory farmed animals that you're eating, for example? And so I actually think that consistency can get us a lot of the way there, because you can peel apart these sorts of issues.
That makes sense, yeah, and I like that. In a way, when you have these sorts of conversations, there's always going to be the question, yes, but why should I care, right? and one of the responses is, well, don't you at least want to be consistent? And I think that's a good appeal, right? That's a difficult one for someone to say, no, I really don't care about being consistent. I mean, they could, and some do.
They could, right? No, they absolutely can. And I unfortunately just don't know if there's a way of arguing them out of that.
No, I agree.
It's biting the bullet, but it's a strong biting the bullet.
Yeah, it is. And I think even if I'm very much amateur in this space, right? But obviously one of the big fiery debates in moral philosophy is about anti-realism, moral anti-realism and moral realism. But I think it's obviously true that even if some brilliant philosopher with a moral realist stance suddenly discovered the underlying incontrovertible moral truths and said, look, I've written the paper, everyone agrees, that's the answer, people would still say, yes, but why should I care, right? It doesn't fix anything for you, right? And ultimately, the only response to that person, I think, is, well, hopefully the rest of us are going to constrain you. Because, I mean, ultimately there is no magical, brilliant, final, compelling moral argument, whatever your stance. So.
But you see, you've gone back and appealed to the social group as the way of rounding out this kind of position.
Yeah, exactly. It's tough, isn't it? But I liked your sort of hint at liking a pluralistic approach, because I think I share that to a degree as well. That's shifted personally over time. But that's partly why with this sentientism idea, I've explicitly kept it pluralistic as to the ethical stance. So it's really clear about the ethical scope of moral patience. It says any sentient being, at least any sentient being, warrants serious moral consideration. But once you've agreed that, you could apply a feminist care ethic or a deontological ethic or a virtue ethic or a utilitarian ethic or some other form of consequentialist ethic. And I think, there's still so much to fight about there. But each of those, plenty, right? But each of those ethical systems, as long as you grant at least a baseline level of moral consideration to all sentient beings, I think that avoids the most serious risk, which is to me that of moral exclusion. Because once you're excluded as a moral patient, anything goes, right? You can be harmed, tortured, killed with complete impunity for trivial reasons without even a moment's thought. So in a way, that's my primary ethical objective of the sentientism idea, is saying at least let's include all of the sentient beings.
I agree. I think it's a reasonable position to make. And there are plenty of arguments left. For example, one is, do you give all sentient beings equal moral weight? And that's a very difficult question to resolve.
It is, yeah. I agree. And again, that's one of the another irritating things about sentientism is it's neutral on that too. Like, so it literally is just evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. But that question about whether you try and take a more egalitarian stance, or whether you do recognize there might be, even if you're egalitarian in terms of like interests, you can still recognize that different sentient beings have radically different interests and needs. And if we grant rights to all sentient beings, the rights that are relevant to each of them could be very different. Or if you recognize there might be different degrees in a multidimensional sense, different degrees of sentience that could warrant different moral weightings, right? Those are, open and difficult and often violently debated questions. But I think that, again, I'm sort of taking the easy way out by backing away from those and saying, look, let's at least make sure all of the sentient beings are included. And there's a risk there, I think, because by backing away and sort of setting that boundary, there's a danger that boundary then gets eroded. And I think you can see that in the popular discourse, where people will say, well, I do care about non-human animals, but I can still find a way for trivial reasons to needlessly harming and exploiting them. So I guess the other thing I'm trying to do is to hold on to a clear and robust, at least minimal definition of what compassion and moral consideration and moral status should actually mean. And I guess my suggested baseline there is, I guess in technical terms, a sort of non-maleficence, which is saying at least you wouldn't needlessly harm or kill or exploit, right? And that's a pretty minimal baseline, right? I mean, hopefully you and I, if I said I cared about you, you'd want me to actually actively help you. But I'm saying, look, the absolute minimum you should expect from me is that I wouldn't needlessly, without a strong justification, harm or kill you.
Unfortunately, as a sort of somebody who teaches ethics, this is your naming of a position just causes me to want to go in for the kill, more or less, to try to break it. I'm also an engineer, so I'd like to sort of break things. But I do agree with the intuition. I think it makes a lot of sense. The questions of what is a need? Is eating a need? What are your needs for vanity needs? How do you divide? For wearing fur, for example. How do we justify this? I'm sure somebody could contrive an argument for some of these things. Is it a convincing argument? Does it get great adoption?
Yeah, and those are tough, right? And I think, again, maybe it would echo our earlier conversation, because someone could come up with a story where they say, look, Jamie, I'm completely on board. I'm with sentientism. I grant moral consideration for all sentient beings, but because of the way I've calculated, the utility of my own pleasure experience, I think it's still absolutely fine for me to order steak, right? And I think where we'd end up is probably an echo of the conversation you were talking about before, where you'd have to appeal to consistency. You'd have to talk about, well, you wouldn't treat me in that way, but at least I think you've got some sort of starting agreement for who gets included. You can then discuss a definition of what minimal moral inclusion means. And, it doesn't mean everyone's going to come to the same conclusions about what's right and wrong, but at least you've agreed a sort of baseline that hopefully gives you a chance for a constructive conversation. But who knows? Who knows?
I agree. That's why I think it's so fascinating.
So on the second part of this question, which we've somewhat covered already, which is this question of, okay, well, who matters? And it sounds like you're on board at least with this sort of sentient-centric approach, that any being that can experience things, that could experience suffering and flourishing, valenced experience, warrants moral consideration. You started putting that into practice yourself when you were 5 by, going vegetarian. Has that thinking shifted or formalized since? Because I followed a similar path, but way later than you, because I was obviously just much more viciously trapped by social norms, and I didn't have that boldness at 5 years old to follow my convictions.
The boldness caused issues in other ways.
Yeah. I'm sure it did. But so I went, I was vegetarian in my early 20s, and then it was probably another 20 years after that where, in a way, I finally allowed myself to learn about the reality of, dairy and egg production and leather production and so on, those other things.
Yeah, exactly the right way to put it.
And go vegan 5 or 6 years ago. But the calibration for me is a bit weird because it wasn't a philosophical choice, and it wasn't a discussion about justification or need or ethics. The reason, I guess, why I stopped at vegetarianism for so long was really a social awkwardness calibration. It was, at that time, vegetarianism was weird. Veganism seemed really weird. So that's as far as I'll go. And then once I decided that position, I would, just like most humans do, right? I'd use the full suite of cognitive dissonance and, social norm compliance and just avoidance and, to allow myself to not have to engage in the topic, frankly. And in the end, in a moment of weakness, those things wobbled a bit and I had to carry it through. But I'm interested in, because that topic about the food space is so resonant with sort of cultural weight and social norms and this sense that, maybe in a way we do need to consume non-human animals. How's that shifted since you were 5?
I think I would describe myself as going through a similar process as you. I wasn't aware when I had a very cartoon version of the world. You killed animals to eat their meat, but the eggs and dairy, etc., were an issue. It was when I was in my early 20s that I went vegan, more or less, and that's kind of shifted ahead based on impossibility of actually being vegan at times when you're traveling, etc. But yeah, and why was I not vegan earlier? For there's really no difference. Like the reasons that people become vegetarian for animal suffering are, by the sake of consistency, should lead them to be vegan. And what leads them not to be vegan is that it's a real pain. And it continues to be a real pain. It's less so a real pain over the past 5 or so years because of everyone that's concerned about climate change. And
it's getting easier, isn't it? I mean, practically and socially, but still.
But it's, we want to be able to say that you should stand on your values and, in the face of significant opposition, nonetheless do the right thing. So perhaps go vegan in a sense in this discussion. Or maybe it would be an abolitionist a couple of 100 years ago. Or perhaps I'm sure we can think of other kinds of issues today as it concerns poverty, perhaps. And it's tough. Do we judge our previous selves for this? Should we feel guilty about it retrospectively? Were we necessarily wrong then? In the way that I think about the landscape of social relations with regard to ethics, I feel as if you have to place some weight in the people you're interacting with. It just is harder to do the right thing in that kind of setting. It might be more virtuous to have gone all that much farther, to be Jain, for example. Jainism that has this very strict set of eating. You can't even pour hot water down the drain at risk of killing microorganisms, which is at least consistent. Maybe they could accuse vegans of being inconsistent with regard to how they would treat sentientism, which gets back to our previous conversation. Exactly what do we mean by these terms? So we can always open them up to interpretation. Your question was about how have I continued to investigate the question of who matters over my life since early childhood. This is all to say, I'm very troubled by my own actions. I would like to be consistent. I know it's an impossible vision. And I also think that it's a good practice. It's the kind of person that I would like to be. I won't get there entirely. And it doesn't just pertain to eating. It also pertains to the carbon that I contribute to the world, for example. One can constrict themselves, though, in all of these considerations, become so. There are these effective altruists in the AI community who you might have run into, who are utilitarians by another name, which is to say they want to maximize the greatest good. And exactly what that means is not clear. And that, at the moment, often has to do with reducing existential risk from artificial intelligence, but they're not strictly related to that. Oftentimes, they also might abide by Peter Singer's views, trying to contribute all their wealth. Is the right thing to do to give all of your wealth away? If you could spend $100 to save someone's life in a poverty-stricken country by, for bug nets or vaccines or something, wouldn't that $100 be better spent? Aren't you therefore, you're valuing the takeout dinner that you spent that money on, the whatever frivolous thing that I'm sure that we could come up with? They're real considerations. I don't agree with them in terms of how they define the good as utility maximizing, but I do appreciate the appeal to consistency in this sense, consistency over other people, along the lines of what you're saying. Staying attuned to that in whatever way we can, I think, is important.
Yeah, thank you. And as we're thinking about and I agree, these are some of the toughest conversations, right? This idea of, we have this sense when we want to be ethical people that there's some sort of perfection we could attain, which clearly is deluded, right? Such a thing is not possible. So how do we cope with that psychologically? What's the right level of demandingness that we can just continue to exist? And these are deep and tough questions. And maybe that's another area where, I've sort of selfishly copped out of those by using this sort of non-maleficence baseline to say, look, demandingness is a really difficult thing. How much should we do to help? But at least we should try not to needlessly harm. But even that is not simple, right? Because every life causes some harm that you could say is needless. So these are not easy things. But I think I like the way you put that, because it almost continuing to wrestle with that and challenge yourself and to at least aspire to be more consistent, to be better, is, part of a healthy life, as long as we can do that psychologically. And
yeah, I can't remember if it was Aristotle or it was Socrates, who said that the unexamined life is not worth living.
Yeah.
And I think that's still true.
Yeah, it's not a bad guide, is it, really? Yeah.
No.
So to round out this sort of who matters question, I think we're quite clear on this, at least, sentience is a relevant qualifier in that context. And again, given your work in the AI field in academia and maybe in your novel too, how do you think about moral consideration of artificial intelligences? Do you think they could actually be sentient? Do you think that matters? How does your sort of philosophy of mind about consciousness and sentience and their nature play into that? Sorry, that's 5 questions in one go. But what if we're thinking about, right, we're thinking about non-human sentient animals and we're thinking about humans, fine, they're in. How do you think about artificial entities in moral terms?
I think it's a very good question. I would say that I still care about sentience, as per my previous question. So to me, it becomes a question of whether AI systems are sentient. Now,
because there's a different approach as well. There's an approach to say, well, they're not sentient, but here are these other reasons why I might still include them, which might be relational or agency or some other basis or dignity, but yours is, the question is still, are they sentient or not? That's still this essential question.
Well, I guess it seems more interesting. I don't think that the other questions aren't relevant. I think a good analog would be, is a human language worth moral attention intrinsically or instrumentally? Say that there's a language that's going extinct because it's a dialect, for example, Gaelic. And is it a moral wrong to let the language die, absent the feeling, like not including the feelings that people have about the language dying, just about the language itself dying. So the feelings people have would be an instrumental. The language itself would be an intrinsic reason. This could be similar to how we would think about it. It's an interesting question. I mean, I think that we could debate that, but that's probably focused on AI right now. So that question in AI might be, well, maybe we should treat AI systems well because it would be bad to us to have treated them poorly. If we're toxic to AI systems, we're spreading toxicity and maybe more likely to be toxic to each other, for example. I think that's a reasonable argument. But the question that I have is more along the lines of sentience, as you describe it. Of course, sentience is, some people use the term consciousness, some people use the term sentience. Sentience is more of a catch-all that skirts some philosophical history with consciousness, and so is oftentimes more palatable. So it makes sense that you're using it for your movement. But it's hard to peel back the distinction between the two of them. Some might say that consciousness is the kind of an ongoing descriptive narrative. It is the ability to use language to describe one's experience or to self-reflect in a certain way. If you define consciousness so narrowly, only humans can have it because no other species can truly use language. There's a degree of communication, but not the same kind of language. But also, if you define consciousness so narrowly and you say that's all that is required for consciousness, then you would have to very quickly admit modern AI systems, for they seem to use language. Or now we could respond and say, well, language, no, that's not what language is. Language isn't the words. Language is the uses that we put the words to. It is the reasons for which we pull these kind of linguistic levers. The fact that I have these needs in the world and that therefore I am using language as a means to acquire it. This kind of view of language would be harder to give to AI systems, but I think eventually we would have to give it to AI systems in that kind of ways that they're going. Now, that's in the philosophy of mind, the one jargon-y term that might split this distinction is the term functionalism. Whether you're a functionalist says that you think that all that certain mental phenomena are, in particular consciousness, is a function. So telling time is a function that both analog clocks and digital watches perform. So long as they tell you the time, even if they're made of very different parts, they do the same thing. And so you might say, well, consciousness is simply using language in this sort of way, like I just described. Well, even if you have very different parts, you've checked the box, you've fulfilled the function appropriately. And this makes sense to a lot of computer scientists and the people who work on AI because, well, we write programs, and this is very clear to us. But there are other views on what consciousness is that are not strictly functionalist in nature. You had Mark Solms on your podcast previously. I think of Anil Seth, Carl Friston. There are Terry Deacon. Dan Dennett actually hasn't come down strictly one way or another. He's more functionalist. These are just all big name philosophers who have talked about these sorts of things, which is why I'm mentioning them. I will just say it's hard to say. I have spent a long time trying to think about exactly what we mean by these different terms, such as I have been describing for the past 2 minutes or so. There's a significant debate as to how we ground out sentience or consciousness. I have my own pet theories as to which are most reasonable in this space. I'm not opposed to ascribing consciousness or sentience to AI systems. I don't think it's impossible. I just have a lot of questions left. And of course, somebody might respond, well, geez, if there's some possibility that you will admit of AI systems being conscious, does this not demand that we, because of the significance of the wrong, for example, of treating AI systems poorly, that we change our actions or change how we interact with these systems? There are a lot of available positions here, and I'm interested in them all.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you. So you're conceptually open to the idea that an artificial entity could be sentient, could be conscious, but yeah, like you say, I think it's entirely appropriate to have radical uncertainty about what the right answer is. And it's an interesting dynamic as well, because for biological entities like us and non-human animals, I find the evolutionary story very compelling. So when I interviewed Mark Solms, who I know is one of the reviewers of your forthcoming book, when I interviewed him back on episode 112, that was the story he was laying out, really. And I've also spoken to Dr. Walter Wiet and others who've sort of shared this view, which is that in simple terms, sentience, this ability to ultimately feel, are things going well or badly for me in the moment, emerged quite early in the development of animals, when the decision environment got to a certain level of complexity that it was useful to be able to weigh up different factors to decide whether to go towards the good and away from the bad. And something like that was the sort of adaptive story that generated, ultimately what you and I are doing now as we talk on Zoom, with quite a few years in between. So that evolutionary story helps, and that explanation helps lead me into my own personal philosophy of mind, which is somewhat functionalist, which is that I think that ultimately consciousness and sentience are just a class of evolved information processing that you and I happen to be doing. And it just so happens that it feels like this, and there's no mystery to that. Whereas other people have this feeling that the feeling of consciousness must be somehow distinct from the function, and that leads them to very different philosophies of mind. In a way, that takes me down quite a sort of functionalist, materialist philosophy of mind route, because I see that evolutionary story and I can see how that's played out. But we don't have that evolutionary story when we're thinking about artificial entities, because they didn't evolve in the same context. So while I have a sort of quite functionalist view that might say, well, artificial intelligence is I can conceptually imagine why they could run a similar class of information processing that would render them sentient or conscious, we don't have that sort of adaptive evolutionary story in the same way. So it's my amateur sense is that, one, we'd either have to explicitly design that in some way, maybe by replicating the information processing of a biological sentient being, and people have done that with super simple worms, for example, where they've actually replicated the pattern of neural firing in an artificial environment, or that there would be some other form of evolutionary analogous process that might have led to them becoming sentient. And that could be through, human reinforcement learning or some other sort of digital process as well. So but it's an interesting mix, because that evolutionary story leads me to quite a functionalist view, which leads me to be quite open about the possibility conceptually of AI, but still quite skeptical about whether today's AI, given they didn't have that evolutionary context, are likely to be conscious or sentient. But
yeah, no, I think it's a very good thing to wrestle with. I'd like, a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned a valenced experience, which I think is important in various theories of emotion. They focus on valence in their discussion with Mark as well on that. You also mentioned having a materialist and functionalist view, which are not necessarily synonymous. The materialist view, of course, is just that all things are material. There's a related position of physicalist, admits energy as a ontological property, but for materialist is practically synonymous with physicalist. Of course, you could still be materialist and not functionalist in position. You could argue that there something about the substrate, the system, is required for the properties of consciousness to emerge. So, and I think this is even, I would say that I'm agnostic to the functionalist position, or rather that I would question at what level the function applies. So is consciousness any degree of information processing, do you need these lower level systems? So as it happens with organisms, we are sorts of Russian dolls, so to speak, of interlocking systems down to the lowest physical levels. We are composed of cells, which are composed of molecules, etc., that work together in this sort of way to produce us as we are. But you don't see this same kind of seamlessness. So we can describe abstractions at which we can separate biological organisms, but they're not true separators. But we do have these kind of true separators in digital systems. Everything gets grounded out in bits, in ones or zeros on your computer. So when it comes to this example that I brought up at the beginning of our discussion, where we were talking about the emergence of wings, both bats and birds have wings. They have found the function of flying, more or less. Now let's compare that to planes. Planes also have wings. They generate lift. Their wings are very different than the wings of bats and birds, but perhaps for the function of flying, all we care about is getting off the ground, more or less. But maybe what we care about, and this is an analogy to what I'm talking about between the interlocking layers, is propelling oneself, that you are furnishing your own energy, that you are thermodynamically constrained, to describe it in a more complicated way. The bat and the bird are thermodynamically constrained. They furnish their own energy. The plane is not. Is one definition. So the function now for flying is not just gets off the ground, but also feeds itself or gets its own energy. Is that the right level at which we should define the function? And so then you can then pull back and think about consciousness in humans versus consciousness in other organisms versus consciousness in AI systems. What level do we define the function? What are the necessary properties? Mark seems to think that it's simply a degree of information processing, that, as you said, things get complex enough that organisms, but really systems, develop internal variables that track the distal state of the affairs of the worlds around them, and that these internal variables come to be the emotions and then are made more complicated by our linguistic handles, that by the language that we use. And then we have constructed emotions of all of the different kinds of things that we experience. And something similar, Socrates' argument, could happen in AI systems, because we can quite mathematically describe minimizing the free energy of a system, of trying to do the least, spend the least effort, more or less. But maybe we need to extend that definition of spending the least effort to also spending the least effort thermodynamically. This is just a third way of stating the exact same thought experiment with the bird and the bat and the plane. Perhaps that function requires us to be physically realized, that is, to be more or less alive. I don't know where to stand. My intuition, as I see consciousness in humans, and as I imagine it exists in animals and other organisms, is that, well, they have this kind of physical substrate. Why isn't it required for AI systems? Other people in AI say, why should it be required? So there's a bit of an impasse.
Yeah, more research required, yeah.
I hope that I haven't gone too far on the tangent here.
No, I love it. Thank you. That's fascinating, yeah. So we share a sort of broadly naturalistic way of understanding reality. I think we share this sort of sentiocentric moral scope, and we're both open-minded, if healthily skeptical, about whether that could even go beyond biological entities too. So the final question is, how do we make a better future? So again, it's crazily big, and you can tell me about sort of utopian visions or the role of creative writing and your novel in sort of influencing human social norms or the role of philosophy in your teaching of ethics and so on, and how that plays in. But I guess writ large, we've now got this picture where, there's about 8 billion humans, and we have some horrific intra-human ethical challenges and practical challenges to fix. We have trillions of non-human farmed sentient beings that we continue to exploit and harm and kill every year. There are potentially quadrillions or maybe even quintillions or sextillions of wild non-human sentient beings free-ranging out there, some of whom no doubt have good lives and many of whom have terrible lives. And we might even be at the point of creating new classes of artificial entities that themselves could be moral patients, and many people think could also have a radical impact, for good or bad, on all of the other biological sentient beings I've just listed, right? So we're always at an interesting point in history, but we are now. So in that context, how do you think about, how can we make a better future? And if you do have a sort of big picture view of that.
This is a tough one for me.
Yeah.
I think being...
It's a bit unfair, really.
Yeah, as endeavoring for such consistency as I do, it's hard to look at the world and look at it positively, I guess. But I would say my better future probably starts with myself. I endeavor to be consistent, to examine my own actions, to do more good than ill, more or less. So I talk about these things, right? I have attempted in the academic way I know how to popularize these discussions in the book that I've written, that tries to explore many of these questions that we're raising and approach them from different angles in a particular narrative. I teach ethics, right? I teach a class I was teaching a class at the University of Washington. I do research on these areas. I can continue to be involved in advocating for the positions that I think are reasonable, like politically. I give comment on AI and computer science related things at I live in Washington State. I'm in Seattle, Washington. So I go to the state legislature and I've tried to advocate there. I imagine continuing to do these things as I move throughout my career. But that's just my personal approach. It's kind of how I stay sane. How can I imagine a better world more generally for all of the different things that you name? I hope that we can do things about climate change. I hope that the people who are worried about AI risk end up being wrong. But I'm not willing to say that they are necessarily wrong. I just hope that they're wrong. There's a difference. I work on those kinds of things. I think it's reasonable to expect more people to become aware of these issues as they're educated about them. I see that in my life talking about ethics. I have difficulty broadening my vision much beyond that, for it's become so uncertain as to be negligible. But I very much value the kinds of work that you do, trying to popularize these ideas more broadly. I wouldn't say that I am necessarily not having a universal sense of ethics in general, trying to maximize the good, also absolves me of trying to fix the world, more or less. I spent a lot of my youth trying to fix the world. I continue to understand that position, but it's too much burden for any single person to bear.
Oh yeah, no, I love that perspective because it's grounded in your individuality, your own role, but it's it's respecting the influence you can have, right? Whether it's formally through teaching or by setting a good example or just trying to be consistent and by advocating and speaking out.
And I guess I would say,
where else could we start from, right?
Exactly, where else can we start from? But we all can start from there, is the other half of it. And that's I think becoming aware of our agency, even if it's limited, is hugely impactful, because we can recognize that we can play a role in the world. whether that's simply in talking about these issues with our loved ones or advocating for them in a local organization or employer or school, what have you. This is where the world changes.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it can change, right? And I do appreciate that sometimes there can be too much pressure and focus on the individual because we have different opportunities and different education and different resources and different privilege, and some people are struggling to get by day to day, right? So that's entirely fair. But I think you can flip too far the other way when you're talking about systemic and collective change, right? Because if everyone sits at home waiting for systemic and collective change, there is not going to be any systemic or collective change, right? I mean, all of those systemic collective things ultimately are driven by speech and the acts and the decisions of individuals. And I think, we could be realistic about our own impact, right? Each of us is one amongst 8 billion with varying levels of influence on a breathtakingly complex situation. But we can also have influence, and that influence is how change happens. And whether that's, sometimes the sentientism thing can seem a little bit naive because it's sort of saying, well, it's quite philosophically focused. If all humans would just agree to use evidence and reason to ground their credences, and everyone would recognize that every sentient being matters, at least in some minimal sense, that would basically solve all of the world's problems, right? So obviously that's naive, although I sort of think it's true in a sense. But the core of the problem normally is not actually about the philosophy, because many people already agree with those stances. It's often about the human psychology and the social norms and the lack of political will and the social inertia that sort of gets in the way of us being more consistent and being more ethical and doing the right thing. Quite often the technical solutions and the win-wins are staring us in the face. It's the social norms and the politics and the human psychology that is, for some reason, just stopping us doing the right things. So.
Absolutely, as you described in your own life, and what took you a while in order to be consistent yourself,
or at least a little less inconsistent. Yeah.
A little less, yes. I don't mean to. I'm not meaning to insult you by any means. We are all inconsistent.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I like that.
So I need to let you go. Before I do, is there anything else you'd like to add into the conversation? Or do you think, because I think we've answered, what's real, what matters, who matters, and how to make a better future. That's pretty good.
It's all done.
In 18 minutes, I think we're there, right? My massive audience just needs to listen to us and go out and put it into practice. But is there anything else you'd like to add into it? And I also wondered if you wanted to lay out a little bit more about the premise of the book, just to give people a sort of teaser as to what they might come across.
No, I appreciate that. As you have said, I did write a book about many of these things. It follows an AI researcher who makes a machine that can write, and as he joins this startup eager to bring on-demand literature to millions, and as this startup brings overbold claims, over promises about the kinds of things that its machine can do in solving the world's problems, Ty, this researcher, is having these discussions at home with his partner, an activist partner who's opposing the technology that he's making, trying to get him to see the reality of the world, more or less. But as this AI researcher is making this tool, this writing tool, not unlike ChatGPT, perhaps, he's also spending more and more time caught between the company and his activist partner. And so he appeals to more conversations with the AI system itself. He's kind of losing himself in the machine of his own creation, somewhat Faustian in nature. Suddenly, when his partner organizes a protest against big tech, Ty is forced to decide what he really values, figure out how to be consistent, perhaps as we're describing it in this conversation. So the central tension of the book is trying to figure out how to understand the difference between right and wrong, real and illusory. Which are the conversations that matter? What is the right thing to do? So it's very much a book that asks us, what kind of relationships do we want with machines? Like, what kind of relationships do we want with other people and with other organisms? There's also which I think you and your readers might like, or your listeners might like, a parallel story of a developing bonobo throughout the entire book. that ends up learning to use some degree of language. That I think would be kind of interesting. So it's a book about many of the things that we've discussed. You can find it on my website, which you can put in the description of the comments, but jaredmoore.org is my website. And another way to also follow me.
That's great. I'll include the link in the show notes. But it sounds a fascinating book. I'm looking forward to reading it. And by the time we publish this, it should be out and on the bookshelves wherever people can pick it up. So, yeah.
Well, thank you, Jamie.
Sounds fascinating. Thank you. Well, very good luck with the launch. It's been a real pleasure to understand your sort of philosophical journey and how you see the world now. And thank you for being a guest on the Sentientism podcast. It's been a real pleasure.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me on. I will endeavor to less inconsistency.
Likewise. Yeah. Always working on it. All right. Thanks so much, Jared. Take care.